Well, hello and welcome back. It's time to talk about the Supreme Court. When we talk about the Supreme Court, we're going to talk about the judicial branch as a whole, where it came from and where it is now, taking a look at several learning objectives that we'll take a look at throughout the beginning of this chapter. So let's start from the beginning. In the beginning, of course, it was that third branch of government after the legislative branch in Article 1 and the executive branch being added into the Constitution in Article 2. Now we had the judicial branch, which was not laid out in very much detail in the Article the third. The framers believed that the judiciary posed little threat of tyranny. So whereas the other branches of government, of course, were checked in a lot of ways, they didn't see this as a big deal too much with the judicial branch. They didn't see this as much of a threat, and it's mainly because they didn't think that the judicial branch would have much power. They did establish a three-tiered federal court system, but they did that in the Judiciary Act of 1789. Important to point out that a lot of the things that were set up in 1789, which is before I was born, are still in existence today. So we have these levels, and as I've already mentioned, the framers of the Constitution didn't think that this judicial branch was going to be all that powerful. And they probably expected that judicial review would happen, but they didn't expect that this would be have a big role in policy making. So public policy, they didn't think would be made by the courts. They thought that the courts would simply interpret the law. We, of course, know that specifically with the Warren Court and other courts, there have been extreme and not so extreme examples of the court being involved in public policy decision making. What we see over time is a movement, an evolution towards judicial activism, and it leads to the court getting more and more involved in public policy decisions. Some people would say that the court is making law as opposed to interpreting the Constitution or interpreting the law. And this happens over time. You can make the argument that it begins in the beginning with the Marshall Court. Of course, Marshall, a Federalist who's on the bench for a very long time, who's the Chief Justice for a very long time. While the court in the beginning does restrict itself in some cases, it is, of course, the Marshall Court that sets up the federal court system and even the national government as a whole for this idea of a national supremacy of the federal government. So in Marbury versus Madison, as we know, Marbury versus Madison, we should be thinking about judicial review, where facts of the case include Marbury not getting his appointment and challenging Madison. And of course, Madison wins. The guy who's not a Federalist wins. But in that decision, Marshall and the Marshall Court and the Supreme Court itself solidifies itself as having the power of judicial review, which means a stronger federal government. So by losing, the Federalists win. And by winning, Madison and his allies don't. McCulloch versus Maryland, again, a stronger federal government. McCulloch versus Maryland, of course, is about not being able to tax something that is constitutional out of existence. It's about the necessary and proper clause. And we know that McCulloch versus Maryland is about allowing federal law to take precedent over state law. We know that judicial review is the right of the federal courts to rule on the constitutionality of laws and executive actions. It's essentially looking at what the branches are doing and determining whether or not they fit into that framework of the Constitution. And sometimes the framework is elastic, and sometimes it's not. The power of judicial review is the chief judicial weapon in the checks and balances system that the Supreme Court and the judicial branch have. The judicial branch gets to determine whether or not something fits within that framework of the Constitution. And we know that Chief Justice Marshall was instrumental in making that happen and solidifying the power of the national government.